So good early afternoon to everyone. Welcome to the LASI's Lunchtime lecture series. Today's lecture is titled Winds of Desire, Energy and Sovereignty in Southern Mexico, and is delivered by one of the most important scholars of environmental humanities today, Professor Dominic Boyer. Dominic is a professor at Rice University, where he also directs Center for Energy and Environmental Research. And I have gotten acquainted with Dominic's research when I was exploring this new field, or perhaps platform, called Energy Humanities, which runs across humanities and social sciences. And what it does is to think through today's reality in terms of energy flows, not only how energy is extracted, produced, and spent, but also how it's exchanged in a number of different relations, such as labor, and also relations between humans of different sorts, such as friendships or even love. So it's a completely different way of analyzing what is happening in today's world. And then I noticed that Dominic has written a book, Energopolitics, which focuses on wind energy project in Guantepec, Oaxaca, Mexico, about which I had heard during my own research in Mexico. And I heard very contradictory things about this project, because I talked to people from the circle of then Minister of Energy, Lourdes Melgar, who have taken ownership of that project and was very proud of it. And I also talked to the indigenous people, Zapotecan people, who were very critical of it and complained that it was taking away from them, and that their fish were not like they had been before. So I am very curious to hear what Dominic will tell us about it from the perspective of his research. And before I turn the platform to him, I wanted to say that next week we will talk to Bettina Cruz, who is one of the indigenous leaders involved in debates and protests connected to the wind energy project in Oaxaca. So all those who get hooked today, please come, and please invite others also to the next week lecture. Before I finish my introduction, I wanted to say that Dominic is not only an anthropologist, but he also works with other media. He has made a documentary film about the first Icelandic iceberg lost change, not a volcano yet, but that will soon. And he also works on a sort of philosophical project with the famous mythical environmental humanities scholar Timothy Morton, reconceptualizing our current reality. And I was fascinated by seeing how the hyper objects, which make for climate change and environmental destruction, turn us humans in the dialogues that you lead with Timothy Morton into hypo-humans, meaning humans who are powerless in the land of so much dramatic change. Well, I don't want to take any more time, and I will turn the platform to Dominic. Please welcome Dominic with virtual applauses, and let's listen to the lecture.
Thank you Thank you so much, Kata, and to all your colleagues for this opportunity. I so wish I could be with you in person for so many reasons, but this is what we can do, and I'm grateful for that. I think it's so exciting that Bettina Cruz is going to be speaking to you next week. Let me also add an enthusiastic endorsement and just say what an impressive mind and political activist, and somebody who definitely should check out. I will tell you an anecdote later on in this talk where Bettina Cruz actually sort of, if not saved our lives, certainly spared us a whole lot of trouble on one of our field ventures. Before I get started, let me just also say that this is everything I'm going to talk about is deriving from a joint research project that I've done with my partner in all things, Cymene Howe, and I'll show you at the very end the books that are affiliated with this project too, in case you want to know more. But this project was an anthropological research project that started back in 2009, and it involved 16 months of field research between 2009 and 2013, looking at wind power development, and especially the politics of wind power development in southern Mexico. So let me go ahead and move ahead into my slides now. So this is the part of the world I'm going to be talking about, the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. And you can see, I hope, from the satellite image that there's this gap in the Sierra Madre Mountains where there is a kind of a pass that allows the barometric pressure differential between the Gulf of Mexico here and the Pacific Ocean to create a natural wind tunnel effect. It's actually one of the most effective terrestrial spaces for wind power anywhere in the world. This is fierce wind. This wind can blow up to tropical storm force without any kind of cyclonic activity informing it. So it can knock over tractor trailers easily. It can strip the paint off boats. And there's a reason why this wind, people call it the devil's wind in this part of Mexico, because it has this incredibly strong, powerful force. So the first part of my talk is talking a little bit about the historical roots, because as Kata was saying, wind power development has been quite a contentious project in this part of Mexico. And to understand the reason for these contentious politics, I think we actually need to go back several centuries to really understand the full depth of the cultural and political and emotional bases of contemporary, both the interest and the embrace of wind energy, but also the passionate rejection of wind energy too. So some of these slides I won't go, I'm not going to read them to you. I'll just try to kind of hit some of the main points on them. You have the PowerPoint if you'd like to go back and read it in detail later. But the pre-colonial isthmus before the arrival of the Spanish is a ethnically rich and complicated place already. It has a lot of natural resources. It has important trade routes that connect North America to South America through Central America. And what's particularly relevant to the story I'm going to tell about what's happening today is that it's the site of the last independent Zapotec, or Binisan, as they prefer to call themselves, kingdom in what's now known as Mexico. And today, if you talk to people in the isthmus about that Zapotec tradition, especially people of Binisan descent, there's great pride that this Zapotec kingdom never truly conceded its sovereignty either to the Aztecs nor to the Spanish. All sorts of complicated alliances and accommodations had to be made, but there was a sense in which indigenous political authority survived those early imperial encounters, even if they had to acquiesce to some extent to certain aspects of foreign hegemony. In that early phase in the isthmus, as elsewhere in the so-called New World, in the 16th century, there's a massive decrease in the indigenous population. At the same time that this figure of El Indio, Indian, appears as a composite subject of salvation, labor, often forced labor, and violence. The Spanish were not unaware that this area was very resource rich, and Cortez himself wanted to have some of his sort of royal holdings centered there. But it's interesting that in terms of the physical presence of a Spanish population, it actually wasn't very large. There weren't that many families well into the 18th century, which meant that the actual cultural pressures of assimilation were less so than they were in areas that were more actively colonized. So that's another part of the story we need to bear in mind. Later in the colonial isthmus, we have the systems of forced labor that I think will be familiar to you who've studied New Spanish history of this time. And something emerges in the late 18th and 19th century, which is a kind of a polarization in the isthmus between the city of Tehuantepec, which is a center of colonial administration, and the neighboring market town of Juchitán that becomes identified as the center of Zapotec political independence and resistance. And you begin to see at the same time that European travelers who come through the isthmus in the 19th century, they begin to depict Juchitán as this kind of ungovernable place where these strong indigenous traditions and identities and unities, and especially violence, are characterized. So I just grabbed a few quotes that I've used in the book, and here in the upper left-hand corner you see Benito Juarez, who's a great Mexican hero, but is somebody who's actually quite reviled in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, in part for reasons I'll explain on the next slide. But the way he describes Juchitán is a place with immorality and disorder, a place where scenes of blood and horror take place. Some of the other quotes talk about the turbulent politicians and revolutionists, others the warlike people who meddle in all political struggles. And the Juchitecos are these ferocious, untamable fighters. And for those of you who study colonial discourse, you know that this is quite common, that whenever indigenous political strength is shown, it becomes a kind of a lawless barbarity, right? And this is true for how the Juchitecos are being defined in this period too. That only intensifies in the 19th century. The city of Juchitán is burned twice within 30 years. The first time in a dispute over Mexican and Oaxacan government's attempt to privatize and monopolize salt deposits. A second time in sort of revenge, Porfirio Diaz's revenge against the murder of his brother. It includes setting up a massive garrison town next door to Juchitán. So Juchitán is this place that is for so long a sort of thorn in the side of Mexican and Oaxacan governance. And something else happens during this period in the 19th century that's very relevant for our story too, and that is the Mclean Pompo Treaty. At this time, the United States was looking for what would later become the Panama Canal Zone, and they were looking at different places in Central America and Mexico where that could happen. And the Isthmus of Tehuantepec was one of the places they looked at. And it got as far as the Mexican government had agreed to cede political control over the isthmus to the United States in perpetuity. So in other words, the isthmus would have been the Panama Canal Zone, but it was only its failure to pass the United States Senate that ended this project. And people don't forget that. They remember this very clearly. And so every time a new kind of scheme of development comes to the isthmus, people immediately think in terms of not only dispossession of labor and resources, but actually the idea that the land might be taken from them in a more fundamental way too. In the 20th century, the story changes a little bit again. Juchitán is already known nationally as epitomizing this violent indigeneity that resists liberal democratic reform, that resists inclusion in the nation. And then this fascinating figure of General Eleodoro Chávez comes into the scene, who is a great hero and a very effective warrior in the Mexican Revolution, and basically is given Juchitán as his own personal political domain in exchange for his loyalty. And he marches a number of his demobilized soldiers to found a new town southwest of Juchitán that is the Colonia Álvaro Obregón. We're going to hear about Álvaro Obregón again in a few minutes, named for his political patron. And basically, as long as Chávez is alive, he is able to keep the political parties out of Juchitán. He's able to bring in some important new infrastructure projects like the Pan American Highway. And it's not until he dies that we get a new fierce round of conflict between the PRI, the sort of single party state that's governing Mexico at that time, and this very, very ambitious student, worker, peasant movement, COSEI, that emerges in the 1970s and 1980s, and that if you know anything about more contemporary Mexican history, are credited often with being the first ones to find a hole in the armor of the PRI, and to the first kind of municipal elections that go against the PRI in the country as a whole. So Juchitán has this fascinating political history that's very complex. And I just feel like it's important to recognize that, to understand the type of context in which wind power is being developed. Now, the next section of my remarks are about Mexican energopolitics. And as Kata was saying, I'm very committed to this interdisciplinary project of energy humanities. And part of my contribution to this has been to think about energopolitics, which is the way in which histories of fuel and electricity inform organizations and practice of political power. And so that's going to inform my remarks here too. I want to start with this image, though, which is an image that was made by the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, in conjunction with the National Renewable Energy Lab in Colorado. It's a map, the first one done, of the wind resource of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. So you can see towards the right side of that image all of these amazing, brilliant reds and royal blues. Those reds and royal blues are wind potential that's literally off the charts. It's above excellent. It's like nothing nowhere else in the world. And to understand why capital interests and state interests are being drawn towards the isthmus, you have to understand just how amazing and unusual this wind resource is. But if we're going to talk about energy in Mexico, we have to start with petroleum, because oil has really continues to be the dominant conversation in energy in Mexico. So I describe Mexico as a petrostate for reasons that will be apparent in a minute. The history of oil starts in the early 20th century. A landmark moment, 1917, where the Mexican Constitution grants the nation, that is the government, the total resource sovereignty over its subsoil fossil fuel deposits. Even so, by the 1930s, almost oil production is foreign owned. That changes when President Cardenas nationalizes the oil resources. And this is a complex story. I can talk more about it if you're interested, but essentially it emerged out of a union labor dispute. And I think Cardenas just got so infuriated with the attitude of the foreign oil companies that he decided to nationalize, and found this powerful parastatal entity called Pemex with exclusive production and distribution rights. During the 1970s, when OPEC is formed, their oil shocks are sort of sending the price of oil all over the place. Mexican oil becomes incredibly important, especially to the United States, and it's boosted, the market's boosted so that it triples over just a decade to 2.7 million barrels per day in production, peaking in 2003 with 3.5 million barrels per day, then begins a rapid decline. And the rapid decline, a lot of it's about just one supergiant field that's running out. But overall, it has to do with the fact that Pemex has been used kind of as a bank by the Mexican government to withdraw funds in a variety of ways, and not a lot of the money is reinvested into development, especially of offshore drilling. So in some ways, Pemex has been a lovely resource for the government, but it hasn't been one that has proved to be sustainable. And that 50% drop off is really, really concerning when you consider that the sales of Pemex's sales of oil actually offer as much as 43% of the federal budget. And we know that from Felipe Calderon himself. We were able to interview Calderon, former president of Mexico, at his offices, his very cushy offices at Harvard University, where he said, oil is what makes all the different biopolitical projects, all the health projects, all the welfare projects of the Mexican government possible. And with a combination of declining production and, in recent years, declining oil prices, this is becoming very fiscally devastating to the government. And we've seen that in the past couple of administrations. And it kind of explains why the current Mexican president has this kind of petro nostalgia that he has. At the same time, the Anthropocene, the geological term for the human impacted era in which we currently live, all of these reckonings of the comings of unprecedented fires and floods and droughts and storms, all of this sort of undermines the premise of the future of what Timothy Mitchell calls carbon democracy in Mexico. There's an image of Calderon at the last wind park, I think it was Piedra Larga, that he inaugurated during his presidency. And Calderon, you can say a lot of things about him, but he was a committed renewable energy activist and an environmentalist. I'm quite convinced of that. We normally think of Calderon as being somebody who's associated with narco violence and with drug wars and things like that. But quietly, in a way that I don't think has received nearly enough attention, he actually brought into law targets in terms of climate mitigation, reduction of greenhouse gases that were really, really aggressive, not just for the quote unquote developing, but were aggressive compared with the United States and Europe and anywhere in the global north too. 35% of Mexico's electricity is mandated to come from clean sources by 2024, and a lot of that is meant to come from wind power alone. So let me just say a few words about the history of Mexican wind development. It really begins in the 1970s with the first studies of the wind potential that show, again, it was not lost on anyone from the beginning that the wind in Oaxaca was very, very special. And at the same time, we have the sort of the neoliberal policies of Presidents Salinas and Zedillo beginning to open the electrical sector to foreign investment, a very complicated and contentious matter in Mexico in its own right. The public parastatal electricity utility, CFE, starts its first wind park at La Venta in 1994 and shows an extraordinary plant capacity. And what plant capacity is a percentage of the theoretical amount of electricity you can get from a power plant as opposed to the actual, right? So to give you a sense, a wind park in West Texas probably has a plant capacity of around 30 or 35%, and that seemed to be a very good resource. In La Venta, it's over 50%. So suddenly people are saying, well, this is something we really need to invest in. And a lobbying agency found in the early 2000s called ANDI, and the Oaxacan government is convinced to take a major development push in the second half of the first decade of this century. And fortunately, and again, partly this was just good fortune on our part, we were able to join to pick up on this story and sort of follow it in this really critical period from 2009 to 2012 as 13 new wind parks came onto the grid, mostly private financed industrial self-supply projects. And what that means is these are projects that are undertaken by large corporations like Walmart or Heineken or Bimbo, which is a food supplier, and in Mexico. And what they do is to lock in lower long-term electricity rates than what CFE offers normally. They come up with an agreement with another company, usually a Spanish company, sometimes an American company, that will build a wind park and then give it to them sort of ready to go. And they will use that wind park to essentially supply their own electricity. And CFE acts as a kind of middleman in between. And that's so the dominant model are large projects on behalf of large corporations undertaken by transnational developers. So that's the model that has existed for the most part. And again, it's a model that people have some different feelings about. But you have to say it's been successful if all you care about are building wind parks, no matter at what cost or who's concerned about them. They have built a lot of wind parks. And so this image here on the left is a picture of all the planned or projects or in construction wind projects in this area, and you see it's very dense. In fact, by 2016, this is the densest concentration of onshore wind parks anywhere in the world. 2.3 gigawatts of installed capacity. To expand that to 5 gigawatts, but because in part of this political contentiousness that Kato had mentioned, it's only become 2.8 gigawatts, and it seems to be somewhat stalled, in part because the current president has not shown to himself to be very interested in promoting renewable energy development. So, but let me also say, if you look at the map on the right-hand side, you can see Juchitán, and Juchitán is right in the center of this. So again, this place with this long history of being a center of violent indigeneity, of political resistance and rebellion against the powers of Oaxaca City and Mexico City, is encircled by wind park projects, at least. And then also I'm going to talk a little bit about Ixtepec, which is northwest of Juchitán. But we actually did field work in all of these towns in the course of the 16 months we were in Mexico. We worked in Ixtepec and Juchitán, in the towns of La Ventosa and La Venta that are small towns almost entirely circled by wind parks now, in San Dionisio del Mar, in Álvaro Obregón. So all over this region, there are people who are being impacted by wind parks and who are involved in the politics. So the third and final part of my presentation is going to be to do a deeper dive to wind parks. Both of them failed. Neither of them, well, I should say, both of them failed in their initial efforts. One of them came back later on with a different name and a different identity in a different location. But the image you see on the left is of the imagination of what the wind park of Mourinho Renovables was. It was being built on a sandbar in the Laguna Superior. So if we go back, I'll just show you here. It's this tiny little, this little sandbar right above Santa Maria del Mar. That's where it was intended to be built. And the image on the right are the plans for the undeveloped still project of Janse Ixtepec. So I want to talk about these two wind parks and why they failed and how their failures can help us better understand the political situation and the questions of sovereignty and energy that are happening in this part of Mexico. So my background image here is a very controversial picture, and if you have a chance to show it to Bettina, or she may show it to you, I don't know. It's a very famous image that was sort of grabbed by activists from a Oaxacan government presentation back in the 2000s. And what it seems to show, and again, here you see the yellow blob there to the center left of the picture is Juchitán. You see what looks like all the land of the isthmus being parceled out and given over mostly to Spanish companies. This is before any contracts were written. It seems as though the pieces of the cake are being carved up, as they say in Mexico, in advance, without any kind of consultation process, without any kind of even competitive bidding process. And this got people very concerned from early on. And so as early as 2006, so this is before they really had browned on most of these parks, Binisa activists affiliated with the Mexican Teachers Union and the regional activist NGO Usizoni were working to try to inform communities and raise resistance about these projects. And the logics of resistance were multiple. Sometimes they were talking about the lack of consultation. Sometimes they were raising issues about food insecurity. What happens if we take all of agricultural land and give it over to wind parks? Who will feed us? Some were concerned with this mega proyecto scale development, which again goes back to that Mclean Ocampo treaty that I talked about a few minutes ago, to just the environmental impacts, the impacts upon fishing and fish populations in the laguna, concern about birds and bats and turtles and foxes. There were a lot of species were brought into the mix here as not foxes, I'm sorry, jackrabbits that were being sort of put forward as being species or relations that would be imperiled by this kind of development. And one of the interesting things that happened was because of just how large the scale of this development was, it actually helped catalyze some new projects of pan-Indigenous political collaboration. And it really did stimulate, we could sort of watch this happening while we were doing our field work, a kind of political renaissance where people became interested in not just rejecting wind parks, but in using the sort of the animus to help build new kinds of Indigenous political projects. And I'll talk a little bit about those in a minute. But first of all, one of the watershed events was the plan to build the Mourinho wind park because it was so big, and it was so big it would impact the fishing areas of many different communities in this part of the isthmus. It would have been the largest single-phase wind park in all of Latin America if it had been built at 396 megawatts. That's a pretty big wind park. And the only way to access the land was it had two choke points. One was at San Dionisio del Mar, where you could access by water, but the only land access point was from Álvaro Obregón, which remember was where Juarez had settled all of his demobilized soldiers and were seen throughout the isthmus to be a pretty militant community to begin with. In fact, people tell us the people in Álvaro were sort of medio loco, they were like half crazy anyway, and it didn't take much to get them riled up. And so, they became the sort of the center point of a political struggle that brought together Icots or Wave people who lived in the bar to the south in San Mateo del Mar and Santa Maria del Mar, together with Benisa people elsewhere in the Laguna Basin. And we saw that these projects of autodefensa, of self-defense against external influence and exploitation really began to gather ground in 2012 and 2013. New communal assemblies began to proliferate around the region. And we saw that there was a sort of a new era of indigenous political autonomy sort of dawning here. That was rejecting political manipulation by caciques, local term for political bosses, by the established political parties, all of whom were in favor of wind power. And I have to say that all of sort of the formal political groups were all in favor of wind power. So it was only these sort of self-organized community groups that were the ones who were really pushing against it in activist networks. And it went far beyond just trying to keep the wind development out. People began to form their own indigenous language radio stations, their own community police organizations. In Alvaro, they prohibited the new community asamblea, prohibited the voting booths for the legitimate political parties to be brought in, which was a huge secondary crisis. They wanted to reestablish communal political institutions, usos y costumbres, which are institutions that exist in some places like San Mateo del Mar, but for the most part, not so much in a lot of the other more complicated communities, more sort of multi-ethnic communities in this region. And so we saw what anthropologist Audra Simpson has called an indigenous politics of refusal, aimed at both settler sovereignty, or you could say kind of mestizo sovereignty here, as well as what she and Elizabeth Pavanelli would call the cunning of recognition, practiced by settler multicultural liberalism. And what that is this sense of a kind of a very contingent kind of political incorporation, where you say, well, yes, we're very happy to have indigenous people as part of our mestizo nationalism. The key thing, though, is you can't be too indigenous and you can't be too autonomous, and you still have to sort of maintain your proper place in our hierarchy of things. And if you try to be too independent and heaven forfend, seek true political autonomy, then we will characterize you as violent indigenous rebels and not as proper parts of the political system. And of course, there's a long history of that, was what I was trying to say in the first section of my presentation. So this all reached a breaking point in late 2012 when Alvaro and San Dionisio both created blockades. And these blockades were disputed within their own communities, because each community was sort of riven by, half to 2/3 who didn't want the park, and maybe a smaller group who did want the parks. And they faced violence from the state police and from supporters of the park project. And it was around this time, I don't know if Bettina will feel comfortable talking about it, Bettina and her family actually had to go into hiding because of repeated death threats against them during this period in late 2012 and early 2013. We personally encountered this like largely by accident. We were going down to Alvaro on the Day of the Dead to do some interviews with the people manning the barricades. And as we were driving into town, a whole fleet of state police cars, police trucks were pulling out of town, and they had just broken the barricade, arrested a number of people involved in the protest, and used tear gas to disrupt everybody else. So when we got down there, people were quite mad, and they weren't sure who we were because our timing wasn't great. It was great in the sense that we had just arrived and this incredibly important event had happened, but it wasn't great to be people who weren't well known who were showing up. And it was only because Bettina had put us in contact with some of her collaborators in Alvaro that we were able to sort of use the right names and make the right connections, that everyone decided we were allowed to stay. We weren't thrown out. But meanwhile, we watched as several hundred more protesters gathered again. Remember, the Day of the Dead's a major holiday in Mexico, so the police had chosen this as a day when they knew people would be tending to their ritual affairs. But once people got word that this had happened, a large show of force was created there. And in fact, they went and they got the workers who were trying to do sort of basic vegetation clearance work on the sandbar, and just yanked them out, stole their cars, flipped their cars over. And in one case here, just battered this truck to basically to smithereens, as part of a series of protests that followed against the wind parks. And this show of force just convinced people that the state wasn't to be trusted and that the wind developers weren't to be trusted. And if there's time later, I can talk more about the wind developers who I did have a chance, or we did have a chance to talk to, who are not sympathetic figures. I'll say their intentions were good, but they had absolutely no understanding of what they were getting into from a cultural or historical vantage point. They hadn't done the homework, and I think for that reason they couldn't understand the depth of resistance to what they were trying to do, because they saw themselves as being do-gooders who wanted to create more wind parks. Wind parks are good things in the world. Back to Alvaro. After this event, this blockade on the Day of the Dead, and this showdown with the police, one of the leaders of the community assembly, the Asamblea Comunitaria, said, if they want to see blood in the sand, let them come. We're the people of Juarez. And in fact, it did become clear that the state police never tried again to break that blockade. I mean, they tried all sorts of other influence tactics to get people to stand down. They tried to offer them jobs. They tried to offer them bribes. They wouldn't take any of it, and they held their ground. And in the end, were a very potent and visible sign of resistance against a development that had not been undertaken in what they felt was a truly cooperative spirit. Many people would say, I've got nothing against wind power. This is not about wind power per se. It's about people coming down here and trying to take our resources. We always just come down here and take in our resources. And again, I wonder how Bettina feels about that today, but that very much seemed to be her attitude at the time. She said, people talk about an energy transition. I don't see any transition. I see the same old mega proyecto politics that this part of Mexico has always seen. As I said, the blockade held, and in the end, the project was canceled. The Oaxacan government tried for many years, with increasing desperation, to relocate that capital so as not to lose it. And in the end, they were able to build the park in a nearby El Espinal, which is up towards Ixtepec. But it never ceased to be a matter of great contention, that project, and it continues, I think, to galvanize people politically to this day. Here's some images from amazing street art and graffiti that was available at this time. I love this one of Don Quixote carrying a wind turbine in his hand like a spear. It works on multiple levels, tilting at windmills and so forth. And then the Asamblea Popular del Pueblo de Juchiteco is an organization that Bettina was involved with, so you could ask her about that more. They organize a number of large events and actions in the Juchitan area during the period of our field work that we participated in and that we discuss in more detail in the books. This image I find is just, to me, is the most haunting one I've seen. It's in La Ventosa, in a kind of out of the way side street. But I mean, think of the multiple layers of signification here: the dried earth, the corn, the staple corn that's lost its moisture, these wind turbines that look kind of like they're made of wood or bone. And it was often the case that people would describe, the turbines as ventiladores, as fans that would dry out the earth, that would sort of pull the moisture out of the earth and impede it from properly distributing the nutrients and the fecundity that one would expect. Second project is one that's a little more hopeful, the Yantza Ixtepec project, and this is a project that was designed specifically to create an alternative to the dominant development scheme, one that could promote indigenous sovereignty and reinforce traditions of collective land use and management. And it's led by a small NGO called Yantza. And the idea was to bring the Danish model of community-owned wind power to the global south. And there were a group of comuneros in the Ixtepec communal lands, bienes comunales, that felt that they were interested in this and had come to the idea on their own. And when they connected with the Yantza folks, it was sort of a match made in heaven, so it seemed. Here are some of the specs on what the project would involve. I'm using euro because they're looking for social investment in Europe. It costs about 180 million euro to be constructed. So this, another thing to remember is these are capital intensive projects. Wind parks are expensive, but that would produce a good mid-sized wind park of 102 megawatts. And the cool thing about their model is they would take half of their proceeds of an estimated 3.5 million euro and put that into a community trust that could do things like fund women's and youth projects, or retirement scheme for older farmers. This, in comparison to what the proceeds are from the private model, the dominant model, is that the communities or landowners usually only get about 2%. So 50% versus 2%, and you can see how because of that, how much more attractive it would be to these politically mobilized communities to go for the 50% model. And so all of the private wind developers fought very, very hard and leveraged as hard as they could to prevent Janse Ixtepec from being built. And they were able to influence CFE that ran the bids for access to the grid to not even allow Janse Ixtepec to bid. And they used a bunch of, fairly detailed arguments for why they couldn't bid, but for the most part, it was because they didn't already have the money in the bank to show that they were a credible project. But Janse Ixtepec would talk back to them and say, well, if you could give us grid access, we could raise this capital overnight. There's plenty of people interested in supporting wind development in Mexico in a socially responsible manner. But we can't do it unless we can't get the, so sort of a chicken and the egg catch-22 sort of scenario. At the same time, CFE was moving ahead with creating the largest substation in all of Mexico on Ixtepec and communal land. The community claimed that they had been misled about that, and that led to an injunction in 2013 from a federal judge that basically put a hold on a certain amount of a bid. It's kind of complicated. A bid to get the last 100 megawatts of access to the grid that Janse Ixtepec would have needed. It went back and forth through the courts. Sener got involved. Lourdes Melgar, who kind of mentioned, is somebody who we actually ended up interviewing as part of this research too, when she was at Sener. Basically, it's stuck in the courts. It may be infinitely stuck in the courts. Basically, CFE has gummed it up and is refusing to participate in a kind of sort of dragging their feet sort of way. Meanwhile, the complications about what constitutes legitimate consultation and informed consent, these issues have become really intensified in Ixtepec as well as in Juchitán too. So that I think that these projects, both the failures of Ixtepec, but also the Mourinho Renovables project, have really helped to cement the contentiousness of politics. And unfortunately, they don't provide a clear path forward. I think if Janse Ixtepec was allowed to be tried, it would be probably quite a successful project and would create a whole different model of community energy in Mexico that could be something that could be quite important for communities and for the country as a whole. So let me this is my last content slide, so I'm wrapping up here. And it's a bit of a summary slide where Cymene and I, rather than speaking of wind power, we talk about Aeolian politics. Wind power often has the connotations as being something good, intrinsically good, salvational. We want to question that and show that there's a really complicated series of politics that are entangled. We have the petrostate seeking to extend itself into the future, trying to incorporate the Isthmus of Tehuantepec finally within the nation, creating white-collar jobs, and finally bringing the isthmus into Oaxaca and into Mexico in a less contentious way. There are also the banks and the transnational capital interests that get very lucrative returns on their investments in wind in the isthmus. We've talked to bankers who are convinced that the only thing you have to do in the isthmus is just buy people and their consent, that there's nothing more complicated than that. It's just a matter of paciencia y dinero, patience and money. Then we have the communities and this long tradition of indigenous sovereignty and autonomy that's going through this fascinating phase of political renaissance and uprising and refusal, and that's a whole other set of factors that need to be taken into account. And then in Ixtepec, we have one effort to kind of commensurate the demands and thirsts for indigenous sovereignty with wind power that would create a new kind of sort of energopolitical situation, but one that's being refused by a government that, for a variety of different reasons, doesn't want to take them seriously. So that is the complex tangle of Aeolian politics that we map out in the books. These are the books. I'll just say that you're welcome to purchase them, but you can also, if you like ebooks, you can download these for free from Rice University. Our library has very generously paid to ungate this content, and we thought it was important to ungate this content given the topics being as urgent as they are. So what these are two books that are two single-authored accounts that derive from the shared fieldwork experience we had. And my volume looks more at the kind of energy and power issues that I've been talking about. Cymene's looks more at the multi-species relationships and the ecological relationships that were involved in the making of these parks and the rejection of these parks too. So with that, I'm just going to end. Kata, thank you for your patience. Thank you all for staying with me. And I think we have some time for questions.
Yes, this has been a very, very exciting lecture. Thank you so much. I immediately I have, while people are bringing their questions, we can do it by raising hands, or also if you guys want to put your questions in the chat, that will also work, and then I'll read them from the chat. But you can also raise your hand and come to the screen and ask your question. I have just first question about what did the government offer Indigenous people, and what do you think would be the ideal way of sort of solving this environmental contentious moment with the Indigenous community, so that it's fair? What was this difference between what was done and what should be done?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and I would say first of all, what the government offered the indigenous people is very little. Really, the government's expectation is that the private developers would offer something to the people, and they would offer like a sort of a signing bonus to a community. But in these deeply politically riven communities, a signing bonus that went to, say, one group would then be shared only within that group's network. Another group would feel cut out. Several other groups would feel cut out. And so there was a lot of fights over how the group that happened to be in power at that particular time, the signing bonus was given, how that money was spent, and people talked about that endlessly. But I think that the second part of your question is really the critical one, which is, what could be done better? And because this was an NSF-funded project, we had to write a public outcomes report, and we have some segments of that in our books, reproduced in our books. And really, what it boils down to is that I think two things. One, communities should be encouraged and they should be enabled to seek their own partnerships with developers that are not mediated by the Oaxacan government or the federal government. I think that generally speaking, there is a potential for success there. But what we heard again and again, where are the obras, where are the works that are good for the whole community, not just money, but where's the commitment on the part of a wind developer to build a healthcare clinic, or to help us with our other development projects we've decided are important in our community. And when we would ask the wind developers about this, they would say, well, that's not our job. We know how to make wind parks. We're not in the business of sort of creating health clinics. But that's what people wanted, is they wanted modernity, sure, but they wanted it in a way that was locally defined. And so, I think if we could go back to square one and start this development process all over again, the smartest thing a wind company could have been would be to come to a community in a spirit of cooperation and generosity first, build relationships of trust over a period maybe of some years before finally getting to the business of the wind park, at which point I think people would be much more accepting. Again, they weren't against wind power, they were against what they saw as an extractive model that was really quite familiar to them from these earlier phases of colonialism.
Right. And also, I remember the question that I heard about was having free energy coming from that park. Was that on the table as well?
Never. But it was maybe after sort of improvements to healthcare, probably the second most common thing we heard that people were interested in was, we would like to actually have the cost of electricity reduced. Mexico has a really complex electricity sales situation where for very basic electricity, like a light bulb, it's deeply discounted to allow development at some level for the poorest communities. But the moment people start to edge up into having things like, a stereo, or having things like a television, they begin to be shot up into much higher brackets, which is very difficult to manage for these poorer communities. So they saw what they felt they were seeing was their prices were actually going up instead of down. Right. So this idea that yes, if a community like La Ventosa is basically saying, we can't grow any larger because our entire footprint is encircled by wind parks, maybe that's a certain sacrifice of the future of this village. Maybe we should have discounted electricity to help us feel like we're sharing in that, in the benefits more deeply.
Oh, that's exciting. Can we ask Alberto? Can we ask Jim to speak, or do we need to go to the chat?
No. He can pose his
Jim,
question.
Jim, please pose your question. Jim? I have someone raising the hand.
I saw it.
Yeah.
I can't.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. I have a couple of questions. You said that legally they're mandating 35% of the energy to be clean. So of the 65% that's dirty, how is that? Is that mostly oil? You said that there's a lot of oil in Mexico, in that part of Mexico.
So because we're talking electricity, that would be mostly natural gas and coal.
Gas, rather than okay. That answers that part of the question. I noticed when you talked about the wind speeds, you said that the average wind speed over the isthmus was a little over 9 meters per second, but that it peaked at 30 meters per second in the wintertime, which suggests to me that maybe there's a large variation between winter and summer. Is that the case? You have
Yes.
much stronger winds in the winter and is that going to be a problem? I mean, if the wind variation is that much between winter and summer, then how do you compensate when the summer winds aren't enough? They don't have any storage mechanism for the wind. So, how can you deal with that wide a variation between winter and summer and expect to get a significant amount of your energy off of the wind?
Well, the good news is, from a technical standpoint, is that even in the summer, you see the turbines are blowing. I mean, there's enough wind to generate electricity even at its most gentle. The problem is more at the high end. The wind almost becomes too powerful for these technologies, and there are a lot of cases of turbines that have been damaged by the high winds. So you'll sometimes see in these very high wind periods that they're idling a large part of their fleet because they're afraid that if
turbines can vary the pitch of their propellers, so that if the winds are like too strong, they just turn their propellers so they don't bite as much into the wind.
Exactly, that's exactly what I was trying to say. Yes, exactly. So there are ways of defending against it, but still, it's remarkable the number of burnt out turbines we saw driving around. So for one reason or another, they seem to be creating some problems for the wind turbines.
All right. We have one more question here from Alberto. Alberto,
okay,
you can pose it yourself.
It just appeared. Alberto, could you just say that again?
Yeah, no, I was just saying if there is a current formal position of AMLO's regarding renewables, and particularly his secretary of the Federal Electricity Commission now, is there like a formal position on renewables?
Well, it depends on who you talk to. My sense of it, and again, I'm somebody who's not been in Mexico during this administration to really talk to people on the ground, but our sense of it from here in Houston is that it's a bit less about a principled opposition to renewables and more about a principled or unprincipled enthusiasm for petroleum. That a lot of the model is reacting to what happened in the previous administration, where there had been some movements that were quite championed in conventional energy circles in the United States to allow for the possibility of foreign investment in offshore oil drilling. People were very excited about that in Houston, as you can imagine. There was a lot of positive press about how great this would be to have the southern part of the Gulf of Mexico developed the way the northern half has been. And so I think that part of AMLO's move seems to be to really reiterate the resource nationalism and to say this is about our petroleum and we're going to develop it and we're going to build a new refinery that's very expensive and could possibly be a white elephant, because as we're watching oil demand decline because of the pandemic, but also because of this transition that's happening, are we going to need a whole lot of new refineries? And my argument would be no. So it would seem to me that it would be better for their administration to think in a longer term way about the fact that there's going to be a global shift towards renewables. It's already happening. How can Mexico be a leader? Because it has been a leader. I mean, I want to emphasize under Calderon, Mexico was globally a leader in renewable energy transition, and I would love you know, to see some of that here too. I think some people hope that AMLO, as a kind of populist, nationalist politician, might be interested in that. But so far, it seems to be he's kind of still clinging to the oil and gas model, and it's just a question of how much longer Mexico can thrive under that model. And things aren't looking great. I'll just say that. Looks like we have another question.
Anybody else? Is that me again? Nobody ever said solar. We don't do much solar in Wisconsin. It's not practical because of the wide variation in energy between summer and winter. But down there, I would assume that you would have, you know, much less variation between summer and winter. And winter, summer is when the wind is less, but that would be when the sun would be better, right? So pairing off solar with your wind sounds like it would be you know, something that somebody should be thinking about. Nobody ever said the word solar, but you guys get a lot more sun than we do in Wisconsin.
Well, that's right, and thank you for bringing that up, Jim, because I think that solar is, and look, well, I will say, in the governorship of Oaxaca that we were there for, Gabino Cuellar's governorship, he was quite committed, not very interested in wind power for reasons that are probably complex. We talk a little bit about in the book. But he was very interested in solar and really saw that Oaxaca particularly could thrive with great additions to its solar capacity. So we talked to people from universities there and from his government who were all very bullish on the prospects of increased solar. And I think in Mexico as a whole, solar is probably going to be more of a growth area than wind going forward. But it depends on development schemes. And thus far, the Mexican government has been very proud that it doesn't offer the kinds of incentives that we do in the United States or that they offer in Europe to financially incentivize renewable energy development. So that makes it a little bit trickier. Is how do you convince people to buy electric cars? How do you convince them to do rooftop solar, those sorts of things. I think these are a lot of things that are probably coming and that perhaps in a future presidency will be taken on seriously.
Questions from the public? If Alberto says thank you.
Thank you,
I have one last question then.
Sure.
We got to the end of our prescribed time. This is not the only story, right? This is not the only story about the conflict between an indigenous community and a wind park. I know there is another one in Yucatan. I've been kind of talked to about that when I was doing my research there. Could you say about other stories, just where they are and how do you compare them to the one that you described in your book?
There are many. I mean, there are many. What we were looking at before as comparators for our experience, a lot of the cases had to do with hydropower, with dams, and with dams that were creating various kinds of environmental and social effects. And so this is another aspect of kind of quote unquote mega project development that people were very concerned of. As you say, in the Yucatan, I've heard as well from some colleagues we worked on in this project that there is a lot of interest in wind, but also a lot of questions about this resource and what its future will be. In Baja as well, in Tamaulipas, there are a few different parts of Mexico that are sort of become hotbeds of wind power development, and I wouldn't be surprised to see many of the same kinds of questions being raised. What might be different, though, is whether they have this deep history of resistance to almost any kind of political project coming from the federal government. Some might not. But I think this was something that we talked to, former Calderon, we talked to a couple of other people who are very highly placed in Mexico City, and they saw Oaxaca as being a special case. They thought because it is so indigenous, because it's always been rebellious in their terms, it's a place where it's incredibly difficult to do any kind of major resource development. And so for them, it was no surprise that wind power was that way. And they were really concentrating on creating private property regimes to break up the ejidos and to break up the bienes comunales, the more collective land regimes that are quite present in this part of the isthmus, as a way of basically encouraging people to think of this as a private decision rather than a collective decision, and for them to institute a private property regime would be the best way to facilitate further development. And so I'd be curious in Yucatan and elsewhere what the property regimes are, and whether that privatization has actually gone hand in hand with greater acceptance of wind power development.
Yes, yes. From what I heard, not necessarily there is a resistance there too, but I'm thinking about Oaxaca, that it's hilly, right? There are mountains. So in a way, these mountains are helping to the resistance of indigenous people to a number of mega projects, agriculture included. So this is very interesting. Then the wind, there is also hill, there are usually also hills. So it's easier and it's more difficult at the same time. Well, we got to the end of our time. So I wanted to say that this lecture is recorded. So if you love this lecture, please tell people about it. We can make it available to whoever wants to listen to it. We will be listening to it for our seminar class next week. So thanks everyone, and I invite you for the next lecture next week.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you so much, Dominic. That was really, really exciting.